Welcome everybody to LTUE 2021. We have plot structure overview here, and just before we get started, a couple announcements. Remember that all the chat for this is in the Discord. The panelists will have some Q&A time at the end, and so if you have any questions for that, go ahead and put that into the chat for the C.S. Lewis room, and we'll get that to them at the end of the panel. Second announcement, the digital art show is in the links channel. After that, we'll go ahead and let the panelists talk about plot structure overview.
All righty. Thank you very much. So, my name is Mark Minson. I will be your moderator today, and super excited to be one of the inaugural panels on this virtual event for LTUE. So, we hope we don't encounter any technical glitches or difficulties, but should that happen, the worst, right? It's not our fault. So let's go ahead and get started by having our three panelists. We did have a fourth, but we don't know what happened to her. Crocodiles in Florida or something. And let them introduce themselves really quick, and then we'll jump right into talking about plot. I would say let's start in the upper left-hand corner with Brandon, right?
Yep, sounds perfect.
Okay.
So my name is Brandon Jones. I am fantasy author. I love writing fantasy stories with lots of intrigue and lots of hard magic. My one published novel is The Broken Man, and it's available on Amazon. Excited to be here, guys.
All right. Christopher?
Yeah. Hello, everybody. My name is Christopher Husberg. I write dark epic fantasy. My first novel, Duskfall, came out in 2016, and it's the first in the series and the final book in the series, Book 5, Dawnrise, was supposed to come out last year, but has been delayed due to COVID. Actually, not my fault, but it's been delayed due to COVID, and that should be out in April. So the final book in the series will be available later this year. Cool. And I'm really excited to be here. I've been attending LTUE for a really long time, and I always really appreciate this convention, so I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. And Justin, let's round it out.
Yeah, my name's Justin Call. Like Brandon and Christopher, I also write dark epic fantasy.
Nice.
Probably the only distinction would be I try to gear it towards the YA and adult audiences together, although it probably leans more towards the adult as the series progresses. My first book, my debut, came out last year as Master of Sorrows, and I think I was at LTUE when it came out, and I was signing books like last year. So that was kind of fun. And my next book, Master Artificer, comes out in May. So keep a lookout for that.
Awesome. Thank you very much, cool. Guys. I'm going to be the outlier in I write YA fantasy, but it's more along it is not dark. I tend to take the adventures approach of mixing humor and action, and so my stuff is a lot more fun. But
we just recognized we're not funny, so we decided not to do that.
Yeah, no.
Fair.
Can't tell a joke
I'm not that funny. I'm not that funny either, but just ask my teenagers. Anyway, let's get started. So, plot structure overview. So we can call it plot, we can call it story structure. So I found 7 different styles online called Freytag's Pyramid, The Hero's Journey, 3-act structure, Fichtean Curve, I believe that's how you pronounce that, In Medias Res, 7-point story structure, and Save the Cat. So what my question to our panelists to get started with is, do you use any of those? And if so, which ones? And if not, what do you use? And of course, the ever important question, why do you use what you use? So why don't we go backwards this time and start with Justin.
Yeah, I do use some of those, although I will say that so I'm a plotter, obviously, and I plot a lot. Like my first book, I'd spent 10, 15 years writing it, and not just writing it, but like building the world and planning for the series. So when I did that, part of that 10, 15 years was learning about plot structure. And so I've read many of these, and in my opinion, they're all tools for the toolbox. I would suggest reading all of them and taking the things that you like and leaving the things you don't. For myself, I love certain plot structures and certain parts of certain plot structures more than others. But the ones that I tend to gravitate towards the most are the hero's journey. And there's a lot of different iterations of that. And in fact, Save the Cat, Blake Snyder's Save the Cat, is also a sub level of the hero's journey. And so I tend to stick to that branch of plot structure. Though I've read the others and I pull from them, I tend to look for something that's a little less formulaic than Save the Cat, and a little less abstract than Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, somewhere in between. So that tends to be my writing method.
All right, Christopher.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm familiar with a lot of the ones you mentioned. I dabble in screenwriting, and so Save the Cat is sort of it's pretty widespread in screenwriting circles. So I'm definitely familiar with that, and I use that to an extent. And so I'll also echo something that Justin said, that all of these are tools for your toolbox, and it's useful. I really enjoy reading about structure in general, because even if I find like 7-point structure, for example, 7-point plot or whatever, it's 7 act, whatever it is, 7-act structure. There it is. It doesn't work for me that well, but I appreciate that I've learned about it. And sometimes when I'm stuck in a story, it's helpful for me to be like, all right, well, let me look at the 7-act structure and see what that would do, what that would call for at this point in the book. And a lot of times that can help me dig myself out of a hole. So I do appreciate just learning about structure in general. And I think it's fun. I'll also say that I'm a little bit more, when I first started writing, I was a hardcore pantser. I wouldn't really I wouldn't outline beforehand. I've since drifted a little bit more towards the middle, where I take more of a hybrid approach. But I find structure very valuable, even if I don't do very much outlining beforehand. Knowing about structure comes in handy when I'm revising, or like I said, when I get stuck or something. But let me just mention the two that I use pretty frequently, and then I can pass the baton. But I use Dan Harmon's Story Circle, and I actually like to differentiate character plot structure with like story plot structure. So I use Dan Harmon's Story Circle, which is another derivative of the hero's journey. It's essentially the hero's journey boiled down to its most basic frame. And so I really like to use that for character development and character plot arcs. For a story, I use Sean Coyne is who I follow on this. He's a New York editor. He wrote a book called I have it somewhere, The Story Grid. The Story Grid by Sean Coyne, and it's this whole method of structuring and revising. But he boils something, you could call this a 5-act structure maybe, but he boils all stories down to a 5-point structure, which is you have an inciting incident, progressive complication, a crisis, a climax, and a resolution. And those can fit into any. The cool thing about structure is that it's so a lot of different forms interweave and connect, and have how you see the same beats through so many different structural overviews, which is also why it's interesting to study archetypes, which is maybe another topic. But anyway, yeah. So I really like Dan Harmon's Story Circle, and Sean Coyne's let's see, what does he call them? The 5 Commandments of Storytelling. Yeah.
Very cool.
Awesome. All right, Brandon.
Yeah. So for my money, everything kind of is the foundation of story structure is the 3-act structure, and everything else is kind of a variant of 3-act structure in some way or form. And so if you're unfamiliar with structure, you really want to start diving into how structure works. 3x structure, for me at least, is absolutely the place to start. From there, you can start kind of, once you have the foundations of that built in, then you can start branching out into some of these other ones. The hero's journey plots really well onto 3-act, 5-act, and 7-act all plot really well onto 3-act. But starting again with that foundation is really that's where you want to start.
Okay. All right. So I know outliners pay attention to plot structure as they craft their outline generally. But should pants or let me rephrase that. Sorry. Why should pantsers also pay attention to plot structure? And that's really it. That's right. It's not an if, but why. And anybody who wants to take that, go for it.
Sure, I've got
Yeah.
that one. So the best way to use, especially for pantsers, one of the best ways to use story structure is as a problem-solving device. Basically, when you've written yourself into a corner, when you're not sure what happens next, or why it happens, or how to get over that next little hump, you can, pull out whatever your favorite or preferred story structure chart or a thing is, and you can look at basically where you're at in the story and say, oh, okay, we're at the second pinch point basically, and I need to figure out what is the change that needs to occur at this point that pushes my characters into like that final conflict or whatever it is specifically, whatever point that you're at. But as kind of a diagnostic tool is the first place that I think I would tell pantsers to go to use story structure.
I would definitely agree with that. I think, I think there's less difference between pantsers and outliners than we like to sort of claim. At the end, both people are telling stories that have structure, because the reality is, if your story doesn't have structure, you're not telling a story. It's just a non-sequential. It's not that it's nothing.
A series
it can be
of
something,
events.
but yeah, a series of events. Yeah.
Poem.
But what I think is, I mentioned I started out as a pantser, and I sort of drifted more towards outlining a little bit more. And the reason I did that was because I wrote the first novel in my series, without an outline. I pantsed it almost completely, and that was great. That was fine. It worked really well. I got to the second novel in the series, and it didn't go well because I didn't have a plot I didn't have an outline for my series, right? I didn't know where things, like I had a general idea of the ending of the series, but how to get from book 2 to book 5 was not at all clear, and I wasn't getting anywhere, just making it up by the seat of my pants. And that's not to say that some people can't do that. Some people can, but I wasn't hacking it. It was taking way too much effort to try and grind it out, pantsing the book, than it was to, eventually I kind of broke down and started outlining, because I was like, this is not working. But what I think, my theory is that, so Stephen King is a pretty famous pantser, right? He almost never outlines his books, but he's also written dozens of books and reads all the time and consumes stories. Basically, it almost seems like every waking moment that guy is consuming story. And so I think, when we consume stories, we absorb. Story is subconscious. Story is something we all understand. People come out of the womb. If people could talk, I think they would be telling stories out of the womb, because it's something we all understand. It's part of life. And the more we consume, the more stories, the more we read. This is one of the reasons I think reading is so important for any writer. The more we read, the more we consume story. The more those, even if we're not like, oh yeah, that's that's the dark night of the soul, blah blah, whatever. We may not say those words to ourselves in our minds, but we're seeing those moments, the dark night of the soul, in each book that we read, or in the movie that we see, or whatever, in the song that we listen to. And we absorb those things, and I, going back to Stephen King, he's consumed so much story that I think it's easy for him to write a novel or a series without outlining. I mean, to varying degrees of success. He has so many books. Some of them are amazing. Some of them are really not. But yeah, and I mean, so when I started outlining, I was like, I don't think I understand. I don't understand structure enough. It's not embedded in my soul the way it is maybe with some people, and that's okay. So I can study it and I can learn about it, and I can integrate it into my writing that way. So
Awesome. All right.
So I can. Should I answer, or
If
should we
you
move on
want
to
to,
the
go
next
for
question?
it. If you've got stuff to, if you've got stuff to say about it, by all means, please.
I've got stuff. Yeah. So I would say for myself, because I've thought of myself as always being a plotter, but I think that comes from a place of anxiety because I don't want to forget the cool ideas I have. I don't want to forget the story ideas or events. So I'm going to find a place to write them down. And the things that I'm really excited about, well, then I'm going to, again, say, well, when is this happening in the story? I might assume it's in the middle. Maybe it's at the end or the beginning. And I find that out later on. People who pants, they're doing the same thing as me. They're just doing it as they write. And so I would have anxiety doing that because I would feel like I'm wasting a lot of my writing trying to get to where I need to be. But for some people, that's okay. And in fact, most people, I think they don't know what their story's about until they finish writing it, regardless of whether you're a plotter or a pantser. Regardless of how much outlining you've done. When I wrote my first book, even though I'd plotted out like what I wanted to happen for the next 4 books, the next 8 books, the next 12 books, even though I knew everything that I wanted to do from here to there, it wasn't until I finished the book that I really understood what my characters wanted versus what they said they wanted and what they actually needed. And figuring all of those things out, like Christopher said, wait, was it Brandon or Christopher? So about the character's journey being separate from the plot. I think it was Christopher.
yeah,
Yeah,
I think so.
Okay, yeah. So, and there's other books for that. And I try to now. I've read a lot of these books, and I've absorbed enough of them. At this point, when I sit down and write my books, I don't really think so much about plot structure because I did that earlier, and I have the outline, I have the structure. And I'm just trying to get into the scene and say, okay, where's the conflict in this scene? How am I trying to change the character over the course of this scene? Where's what change is occurring? And those little beats, those little steps within the scenes are my primary focus while I'm writing because I already did all the homework ahead of time, so I don't feel so anxious about writing myself into a corner. I know the direction I'm going. I might still write myself into a corner within a specific number of chapters because I'm trying to merge story threads and character arcs and make sure they line up at the same time, and it's technically challenging, but I'm able to do that because I've done all of the outlining ahead of time, and that for me frees me up to be more comfortable with the writing that I do. And other people who are more comfortable with themselves and are less anxious, maybe they don't need to do that as much, and they can just do their writing and then afterwards go back and fix or delete or change or add to whatever they want, and they'll be successful.
Speaking as at least the partial pantser, I also have anxiety. I think anxiety just comes with being the writer. But yeah, I think I agree though.
All right. Okay, so that brings us to the next question, of course, which is, do you fit your story to the structure, or do you fit the structure to the story? So how much manipulation as you're going along, right? And you've reached a turning point, or you've reached this point where you're like, okay, something needs to happen here. How much then is that driven by your structure versus story? Brandon, why don't we start with you?
Sure. It can really go both ways. Certainly, being aware of your structure when you're trying to come up with the next point. I mean, you don't want to go totally against the structure of the story that you're writing, and so being aware of kind of where you're landing along the line of whatever story structure that you're using. You don't want to accidentally add in a secondary inciting incident like 2/3 of the way through the book, or that's an extreme example, but and so it has to inform it at least to some extent. Um, on the other hand, obviously you don't want, like, we're all writers, at least in part, because we love freedom, and we love the freedom to just explore ideas without people, like, we've all sat down and read a book or seen a movie and been like, I could do that better. And so, like, we want to have that control. And so having a structure that just locks us into a specific event, or whatever you might have it. Yeah, I don't know very many authors that are like, yeah, that's definitely the way to do that.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think, I mean, for me, again, it goes back. Well, first, let me just put this caveat out there. It's going to be different for everybody, and it's probably important for each writer to figure out, how much structure they need to be using, how much it needs to dictate how they write. But for me, definitely, it's that's the wrong way to think about it. Do I make the story fit the structure, or the structure fit the story? That's not a helpful way for me to think about it. It's more, how can I use structure to either facilitate my writing or to make it better. Usually on a first draft, if I'm getting stuck, then it's really helpful to consult various structural theories and say, I think I mentioned this earlier. What would this theory say happens here? Is that happening here in my story? Or if it's not, does it need to? And then I can make decisions and go from there. It's almost like a writing prompt, right? So it's, just looking them at structure as a tool is kind of the best way for me to approach using it as a writer.
All right. Justin?
Yeah, I'm thinking about a lot of things. I think that when you use story structure, the advantage that you have, in addition to all the ones we've discussed, story structure has resonance. That's why we talk about all of these different structures we've talked about, the 3-act structure and the hero's journey and all these other methods. They overlap and overlay in so many ways. And recognize these familiar beats as a writer, and certainly as a reader, even if you're not consciously paying attention to it. So when you have that structure in your story, whether you've attempted to do it on purpose or whether you've done it subconsciously or intuitively, the structure should be there. And if so, you have resonance with the reader. They're going to sort of anticipate what's coming because they know stories intuitively, because we grow up in a culture filled with stories. And so that's an advantage. But at the same time, if you rely too much on those things and become too formulaic, we lose the spontaneity, the ability to surprise people. You have a bad story. So if you're trying to force the thing you're writing into a structure, you're going to have a bad story. You need that spontaneity. You need that creativity. It's creative writing. So you need to have that, and you need to allow your characters and your events to occur in a way that feels natural to you. But a good way to keep yourself from going off the rails and writing yourself into a corner is to have these things in place to kind of course correct as you go. One thing that I try to do when I write, I love tropes because they're fun to invert. So I like to find ways to give people something really familiar that resonates, and then surprise them by not doing the thing they're expecting. And if I do that, then I'm giving them the best of both worlds. And sometimes I don't invert the trope, and then they're waiting for me to pull the rug out from under them or drop the other shoe, and that's fun too. I think to force yourself to either use or not use or choose one over the other is, as Christopher said, the wrong question. We need to make those things feel organic to ourselves and then allow the story to carry us along. And if you find yourself forcing it in, maybe this is another opportunity to solve a problem. You say, well, I forced it into this place. I'm just going to keep writing because I want to stick to my plot. Later on, I'll go back and fix it. And you may find it ends up working anyway, and you were just obsessing about it. Or it ended up not working, and you're going to have to rip that part out and redesign something to fit into that hole in your story that connects all the other points that you have. Otherwise, you're going to have to rewrite everything. And all of that's okay. Writers have to do that sometimes. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So if you're okay with that, sure, push it in, fit it in, and then move forward. And then later on you can fix it. But ideally, we can solve it as we go so we don't have to worry about those problems in the process. But I know Brandon Sanderson, for example, when he writes, he's like, figure out this thing later.
Yeah.
And then he'll just keep going. Like, he's always about momentum.
Yeah.
And kudos to him, because that's very difficult for me to do.
Mhm.
I don't know if I can do that. I've attempted to do it. But I find that I have to ram my head against the wall and write several bad pages or dozens of bad pages before I can get out of that space and move forward. I don't feel comfortable writing a new scene chronologically without the steps to get there. Even if I have to go back and rewrite, I need the original writing to get forward, personally.
Justin, you mentioned formulas, and you kind of made a distinction, which I just want to emphasize because I think it's really important. I think it was Robert McKee, who was like a storytelling kind of guru in the film industry. He wrote a book just called Story. Just Story.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's great. It's a fantastic resource if you want, to delve into more. There's plenty of resources out there, but that's a great one. And he basically
especially for
said
characters and conflict.
Yeah, especially for a character. Totally. Yeah. But he said that, story structure is about universal forms, not formulas. These aren't magic formulas that we can, or scientific formulas even, where we can just put in the right ingredients and magically have a story. They're forms that we can look at and learn from and say, okay, so maybe that's something I can use for my own storytelling. And even, Joseph Campbell, who he wrote The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which is the basis for the hero's journey. He wasn't a storyteller. He was anthropologist, right? Like he studied like thousands of different cultures, and realized that there were these similar beats happening in the mythologies of so many different cultures, and he compiled them into this hero's journey. And then other writers kind of noticed this and said, hey, that's really cool and also useful for writing. Let's apply this to like a structure, from a structure perspective. But he wasn't doing it as a writer. He was doing it as a historian, an anthropologist, somebody who studies culture and mythology, and saw all the connections. And so he saw these forms that were present in so many in the mythoses, in the mythologies of so many cultures, and put them together.
Mythos, I think.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So plot comes, a lot of what we look at as plot structure just comes from the human experience, and just kind of how we want. I mean, we all live vicariously through what we read, right? I mean, even in the most outrageous fantasy, we want to be there, and we kind of, a good writer will take us in, and plot to me just is to make sure that is the best ride ever, right? And so I think that's a big part of what it is I look at plot structure for me as a roller coaster, and how much fun is a roller coaster if you have a really big hill at the beginning and then the entire rest of the ride is just a flat straight track. Right?
Ooh, yeah.
Exactly. The big hill is meant to get you enough momentum to get you through all the rest of the curves and the twists and the turns that make it a thrilling adventure. So, all right. So since you all write dark fantasy, this might be, I don't know. This is going to depend on how well read you guys are.
We only read our own writing, clearly, because that's how you evolve as a writer, by shutting yourself off from the others.
That's right. Pro tip.
There you go. Right. So are there certain structures that you find in particular genres that tend to work better for one particular genre than another? And what might those be?
I mean,
My gut instinct is no.
Yeah, I mean,
But
I would say no.
Somebody else answer.
Well, I mean, if you look at really broad genres, like screenplays have a very, especially Hollywood screenplays have a pretty specific structure. And
they have to because of the length.
Exactly. And so that whole industry is almost dictated, not the industry, but the writing in that industry is dictated by the industry itself because of constraints. And that's, I mean, I would say things, Hollywood writing has changed a little bit in the past 5 or 10 years, just because TV shows have become a lot more cinematic and higher quality, both in the writing and the production department. So that, I think, even that is shifting a little bit. But well, and especially with with theaters possibly. Anyway, that's a whole can of worms. But but I would say that at least that genre, that industry has pretty specific rules and structure, a structure to follow. But when it comes to literature, I'm more inclined to agree with Justin. I don't think so. I don't think there are any. I mean, maybe, but I'd have to do a lot of research or something just to maybe find, something like that.
I feel like if you
Go ahead,
Brandon.
Okay, thanks. You have to get pretty niche, I feel like, before you start running into things that don't work as well for fiction. One of you may disagree with me, but I feel like Harmon's Story Circle is maybe not quite as suited for fiction as it is for television, for screenplays. It's so circular, and it ends with the character basically in the exact same spot that they started, with just a slightly different outlook on life now that they've gone through the course of the show. And that,
because it's episodic storytelling.
Exactly. It lends itself really, really well for episodic storytelling. So for novel length kind of stuff, maybe you could make it work. It's probably not, it wouldn't be my first choice. But that's really, really niche at that point.
I would also make a distinction between structure and tropes. Just to be very clear, right? They're not the same thing at all. Tropes are like recurring themes and images and even scenes or something that happen in different genres. And there's plenty of recurring themes and tropes that we expect in the fantasy genre or whatever, or in the romance genre. There are tropes that we expect, and if it doesn't have these tropes, it's not going to feel like a romance book, but it's different from structure. You can throw in tropes to a structural outline. You can even use them as specific points in the outline, and that's totally fine. But they're different. Tropes can be, and both can be subverted and changed and used in different ways, and that's great. But they're different enough that I think it's worth pointing out. So.
All right.
Okay. I was going to say something and then I forgot what the question was. Because your answer was so good, it drove all other thoughts out of my head.
It was.
Yeah.
It was. Are there?
Oh, related to the genres. Yeah.
Yes, the structure and genre are they tied together? Do you have freedom depending on what you're writing?
I think you always have freedom. It's just, do you want to write a story that feels good and is satisfying and the characters evolve and change? Or do you want to have a story where they don't evolve and maybe it's a tragedy? But at the end of the day, you still have to have conflict. And conflict is at the root of every story. So a story without conflict is nothing I want to experience. It is a series of events that is boring. It's like the difference between an activity and a game. A game, there's a point to it, and there's a direction, and there's challenges to overcome. An activity is like Chutes and Ladders or Candyland. You're rolling the dice. You're not making any decisions. When we are, can you tell I'm going to be in the gaming panel later? When we are, when we're writing stories and that we need that conflict. It doesn't matter whether you're writing romance or mysteries or westerns or fantasy or screenplays. They all have conflict, and they all kind of come down really to character, regardless of how you choose to plot the events of your story. I will say that because we are writing epic fantasy, there are certain themes and forms that, by the very nature of being epic, they tend to be more obvious and more overt. And in someone else's genre, they're going to be much less overt because they're not epic fantasy. You don't have a hero running to find the magical talisman that's going to save people. It's the talisman is like reconciling with their father who's been away from home for 20 years or something. And that's abstract. But with epic fantasies, it's generally less abstract. We probably still have some of those abstract themes, but because of that, sometimes people will say it's formulaic or there's a lot of archetypes or a lot of tropes. But I would say if it's done well, obviously it's not. But all stories have these things. And so I don't think you can get away from it. And I would say, at least for myself, when I'm writing dark fantasy or dark epic fantasy, I gravitate in that direction for plot structure because I've gravitated away from the extremes of like nihilistic grimdark and noble fantasy where the hero is always good and the bad man is always bad. I like something that feels more realistic where I'm more likely to believe it because this is what I would expect. And then finding ways to surprise people. And I think when you're writing a story using these forms, these structures, you need to know your own voice, your own themes, your own intentions. If your intention is to completely destroy what people are familiar with, that is a style of writing. You want to shake things up. If your intention is to build people up on the things that they believe, that is another style of writing. If your intention is to question those things and then help people find the path for themselves, that's another structure. And they're all kind of independent of outlines and plots. So if you can discover that part of yourself as a writer and what you want to achieve, I think that's going to inform your writing more uniquely than which plot structure you're going to choose or which book you're going to read.
Okay.
I remembered, Christopher.
Nicely done and well said.
I recovered. Thank you.
All right. So the last question I've got, and then we'll turn some time over for questions from the audience, is so J. Scott Savage has a 4-part pacing structure that he uses. So can you use pacing to structure your plot? Or do they go together?
That's an interesting question.
I'm not familiar with his story structure and his pacing. I do use generally 4 parts to my story. When I try to sit down, I think of it as 4 parts. So this intrigues me, but I'm not familiar with his pacing. Would you explain it for those?
Or yeah, sure, that would actually be helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, Mark, teach
right.
me.
Well, I was not anticipating this, so
You just assumed we'd already read all these books you're referring to.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
No. So it's just kind of the first part is the character is involved in a conflict that is not the actual conflict for the story. Right? They have a problem completely unrelated. And let me see if I can find it.
This reminds me of they talk about this on.
So here it is.
Oh, go
ahead. You introduce the villain in the first quarter of the book, even if it's only referring to them. Let me see. He replied to me because I asked. I was not familiar with his 4-part pacing either. Let's see.
So the Writing Excuses podcast that Brandon Sanderson and Mary Robinette Kowal, and I'm sure most people who are listening are familiar with. They have several of their episodes that talk about pacing and how it can inform plot. And I don't know if this is where you're going, but while you're looking at your notes,
Right.
Mary Robinette pointed out that there's like scene caesura, like action and then a break, a rest for people to kind of process what they've experienced, and then more action, and then and I think that is one way of looking at pacing, and I think that's relevant. But is this related or is this different?
That's a little different, but it's I like that as a structure also, right? Because that's if you look at a lot of the graph drawings of plot structure, right? That a lot of them are on either a curve or an angle, right? As they go up, and I think that really lends to that downside is the slower down. Everything's just been super intense, and let's back off. Let's have a conversation. Let's talk and process about what's going on. Maybe some small minor things happen, but it's to keep action moving. But at the same time, it's just not that intensity that you have been having. And so I don't know. For me, I guess it feels like that really actually does work as a plot structure in and of itself to keep your pacing, to help you keep your pacing at a good clip, right? Don't just go at it, because you like the roller coaster can't just have one big hill, and at the bottom of the hill the ride ends, because you're screaming all the way down the hill and then it's over, and you just can't even process what just happened to yourself, right? So Jeff's is part one, he calls the Buffy beginning. The conflict, there's a conflict, but it's not the main conflict. It kind of introduces the characters and the world. Part two is where your main character begins their real journey. But they either the reader, the main character and maybe even the reader don't even know the one key thing. It's kind of a misdirection point. Part three is that the key revelation is suddenly made and everyone's like, oh, this is what needs to happen. And then part four is the car chase section, where you've got the big problem is completely revealed and that only the main character has a way out.
I mean, it feels like it overlaps with the other storytelling forms that we've already talked about. It's just a different way of, I mean, even the pacing that you're suggesting, the other forms have pacing in them too, and this one isn't any more overt, I think. But maybe I'm wrong.
And I think generally structure, it can be a good tool, like to just mark your milepost, right? And say, are there 30 chapters of them like doing the friends, enemies, allies section of the hero's journey? Well, maybe that's too many, right? Maybe that's taking too long. That's a huge exaggeration. But the idea is, if you're spending way too long in a certain point of the structural outline, then you should probably think about trimming it a little bit, or vice versa. If you skip a few and just jump straight from crossing the threshold to coming back over the threshold or something, then you probably need to add some stuff in between and flesh it out a little bit more. So I think it is really helpful to use it as a general, like, mile markers, for pacing. I think that's helpful.
Right.
Yep.
I would say too.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Brandon. I talked too much.
You're first this time. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll jump in. In Blake Snyder's Save the Cat, he talks about forms, and he talks about different A stories, B stories, C stories for characters that are not the primary character. A lot of times when we're writing epic fantasy, we're writing more than one point of view, and I will use pacing and character points of view to strengthen my story. So if I have my main character and I plan on ramping things up very slowly and then having a very climactic ending, the beginning by its very nature is not as exciting. So I probably want to stick something in there to keep readers invested while I build this solid foundation for something climactic that's going to happen later. And so if I have these other story arcs, then you can overlap one character's spike, and in the next chapter you're reading at this Ashura, this rest with the protagonist as he's ramping things up. And so you can kind of get a wave going where readers are constantly riding on someone's climactic moment, some moment of action, and also resting as we switch between the characters. And it gives people a chance to kind of digest what you're feeding to them. And I think that's helpful for pacing, especially when you're writing multiple points of view. Go ahead, Brandon.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, kind of going back to an earlier point that I made, as far as pacing goes, this is when you're working with a writing group or beta readers or whatever your particular system is, and they say, man, like this portion of the book right here feels really slow. Like it just feels like we hit a slog right there. This is a really good time to go in and look at a plot structure and say, oh, shoot, I totally missed the midpoint here. I need like a midpoint action sequence or a midpoint crisis sequence or whatever the your specific story requires. And ultimately, that can absolutely help inform at least large scale pacing like that.
All right, awesome. Okay, so we're down to about 5 or 6 minutes left in our panel. So if we want to open it up to questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. First question we had from Trevin. They asked, does Christopher actually use StoryGrid spreadsheet? If so, does he fill it out before or during or after editing phase?
Yeah. So I don't use it with everything. So just a little bit of explanation for people who have no idea what the StoryGrid spreadsheet is. Sean Coyne, who I mentioned earlier, who he kind of basically adapted these 5 commandments of storytelling from Robert McKee. He also has this really elaborate StoryGrid spreadsheet, which is this huge spreadsheet that basically tracks every scene of a story and takes, marks down a number of different aspects of that scene, anything from word count to does the emotional variance of the scene, and it's pretty complicated, which is why I don't use it for everything that I write. I would never use that before I wrote a story, and I think Sean Coyne, even in his book about the story grid, I think he even says it's not the best idea to do that before you write a story. What you should do is write your story, and then you can look at it scene by scene. That's the story grid is a great way to look at your story scene by scene to see if it's working on multiple levels, for anything from a pacing level to a character arc level to whatever. And so I when I use the story grid, it is always in a second or third draft. That after my first draft, I'll break it down, fill out the columns and so forth, and then look at it from there. So for me, it's always after a first draft, and I'm pretty sure Sean Coyne also recommends that as well. But that's not to say that who knows what works for people and what doesn't. So I wouldn't say don't try it, but I would say don't put too much energy into it, because if you're story gridding a story, you're not writing a story. It's better to write a story and have it written and then figure it out. So. But that's also coming from Panzer. So anyway,
jumping on that bandwagon real quick, I under the theory that some of the best works of art are done within really tight restrictions. Nobody remembers random poems, but we've got all these sonnets that are just really, really specific. I've tried in the past to stick beat by beat all the way down to like scene, sequel, really minute level details for an outline. And my experience is that it's just a little too restrictive for something that is novel length. Maybe I'll crack the code on that someday, and I'll have the secret to perfect stories beat by beat. But I think that's a little too hard when you get that detailed. It gets too hard for a early plotting session.
Chokes your creativity out.
It does.
All right. Do we have another question?
Yeah, we've got a question from Spencer E., who asks, if you find your story no longer fitting your intended structure, would you recommend changing the structure or reining in the story?
Again, I would say no to both of those. I would say let the story be what it is, and then later maybe ask those questions. But it reminds me of the earlier question where it's that's the wrong question for me to ask. Oh, it's not fitting my structure. Should I panic? No. I think I should just see where the story's going to go and go from there.
That's definitely going to be really individual. My instant reaction is to say, look, like you start at the beginning with a structure. Something that drives me a little crazy when authors say it in an endearing way is, oh, my characters decided to do something totally different. Like, no, like you're writing the story, make them do what you told them to do. And like go ahead and like push forward. And you can typically, I look backwards and say, oh, okay, where did I make a decision before that meant that I can't continue the structure, rather than shifting structure at the point that I'm at in the story. But
So
I'm much more of an outliner.
I'll add to that, and I'm, as I said before, very big on outline, and yet I have been guilty of saying that exact phrase. The characters decided to go somewhere else. So, and I had this problem, like in my first book, there was a character, I outlined 12 books for my series, and there was a character that was not part of my outline who appeared and gradually throughout the course of the book became an important character that affected the story in a significant way. And then later on, I had to go back to my other outlines and say, how am I going to integrate this and make this useful? Because the character was good in the story. And so I sort of followed that instinctively, knowing this character was a foil for my protagonist and this was a good addition. But I would say don't throw it out. Whether you choose to forge ahead and try to keep that thing in your story and make the story work, or whether you choose to rip that thing out and write it according to the outline you have, you need to finish your story before you'll be able to look back and say, that was a good decision. That was a good choice. Or you'll say, that was a terrible idea. I need to go back and fix that. And maybe in the process, you'll realize it was a bad decision. You can go back earlier. But yeah, don't second guess yourself.
And you may even realize as you follow that little, variance in your structure that it comes back around to fit in the structure in the end. Like maybe you're subconsciously, inserting a part in the story that you maybe don't even understand right in that moment, but you follow it through to the end and it actually fits. It also may not.
Yeah.
So don't take, that's not. But anyway, yeah.
And a lot of those times, those surprises really enhance the structure in ways that you didn't expect. My way of looking at it is if they're truly breaking the structure, then maybe it's time to look at ripping that out. But it may be enhancing more than you realize in the moment. So,
well put.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. If you want to go ahead and give a quick where to find you, we'll go ahead and get ready for the next panel.
Perfect. I'll jump in and start.
Yeah, go ahead.
Easiest place to find my work is at Amazon. Again, Brandon Jones. The novel is The Broken Man.
Christopher Husberg. I'm on a panel tonight at 8:00, Vampires Throughout Fiction, so that'll be fun. You can find my books on Amazon in most bookstores. The Chaos Queen Quintet is the series title, so yeah, check it out.
And I'm Justin Call. My series is The Silent Gods. It's a tetralogy, but I have 3 in mind. As I mentioned, there's 12 books. But the first book, Master of Sorrows, is already out. Master Artificer comes out this May. You can find me on Twitter at Justin_T_call. I have a website too. My books are on Amazon, on Audible, in bookstores. So check them out. Thanks, guys.
All right. And I'm Mark Minson, and I've got another panel tomorrow at 5. Where I get to be panelist and not just moderator. And you can find my trilogy, the Phoenix Cycle series, on Amazon.